Okay, I'd like to call the meeting to order. First, I'd like to recognize we're doing business on Tishat and Hoochess of First Nations unceded territories. You can't hear? Okay, is that okay? Okay. Notice to attendees and delegates that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube on the Regional District website. Okay, can we get an approval of the agenda? Or motion to approve the agenda? So moved by Brett. Oh, good idea. How about we'll start with Daniel and we'll do introductions going around this way.
Sure. Daniel Sayah, the CAO for the ACRD.
Red Boyko, Electoral Area Director for Beaufort.
GM of Planning and Development.
I'm Alex Dyer, Planning Manager at the ACRD.
Mike Sparrow, Director, Cherry Creek.
Penny Cody, Albury Lakebot, Sprout Lake Rep. Oh, I'm showing up this.
Oh, that's funny.
You're there. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon. Wendy Thompson, General Manager, Administrative Services.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Is it working? Oh, what a shame.
It's coming in. There.
Okay.
It's just a little slow.
Okay, now can I get a motion to approve the agenda, or if there's any additions to the agenda? Director Boyko,
I'll provide a motion to approve the agenda.
thank you. A seconder? Bob? Okay, Director Beckett, thank you. Okay. All in favor? Motion approved. Okay, now we'll move on to the minutes. The Electoral Area Director Committee meeting minutes held on February 23rd. Could I get a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll give a motion that the minutes of the Electoral Area Directors Committee meeting held on February 23rd, 2023 be received.
Thank you, Director Boyko. A seconder? Thank you, Director Sparrow. All in favor of the minutes? Motion carried. Petitions, delegations, and presentations. We don't have any. Thank you. Correspondence for action or information, nothing. Requests for decisions. Rezoning application procedure options. Is there someone to speak to this? Mike?
Yes. Yeah, I'm happy to speak to actually the next 5 reports. So thanks everybody. This is the first report that we have on the EA Director's agenda today. And it deals with options for not holding a public hearing for certain rezoning applications, specifically those that comply with the current or existing OCP. I do want to note that the ACRD holds a lot of public hearings, which require a significant amount of staff time. So just for example, in the report, we talked about in 2021 and 2022, we held 27 public hearings. And to date, in 2023, we have held 13 public hearings. So this process would still involve a public notification and public input opportunities. And there is always the option to hold a public hearing. What we're proposing is the staff report would put forward a recommendation where it's permitted and actually makes sense to use section 467 for public notification rather than holding a formal public hearing. But the recommendation would also include an option to hold a public hearing if that's something that the directors of the electoral area wanted to move forward with. So on page 8 of the agenda, we just drafted a sample a sample recommendation and what it would look like. So, you know, the first part would be the recommendation. You know, it's a little bit different. The board would not, the way the legislation is written, the board doesn't give first reading. They just provide notice to proceed with section 467 notifications. Staff would then provide the formal notice. It would look really similar to the public hearing notice, or a good example is what we do with temporary use permits. They don't require a public hearing or public meeting, but there is formal notice. There's ads in the newspaper provided. Those would be sent out to be the opportunity for feedback to come in before the board consider first reading of the bylaw. And you know, just above the example recommendation, just highlighted some of the steps, and I won't run through all of the steps, but you know, under 467, you know, the board would give first, second, or has the option to give first, second, and third reading all at once, and then there would be a pause before a meeting's adopted. It does reduce the processing time as well, so things can move along, you know, fairly significantly. And I'm going to use an example that hopefully I will put on next week's board agenda. Is last board meeting, the board one of the things that was directed out of the changes to the new zoning bylaw project was that we move ahead. We were directed to move ahead with increasing the accessory dwelling unit size, so the laneway homes, etc. So that is something that only applies to the OCP areas. So you have to be within an OCP area to have an accessory dwelling unit, and so this is something that could be waived, and it's something that the board has, the board has had. We've had a lot of public consultation about it. We haven't heard any negative feedback. It's been reviewed by the Advisory Planning Commission, etc. So if the board supports using this section, the notice section, what we're talking about now, and not forwarding it to all of the APCs for a meeting, the timeline could be where this would be adopted in January. January. The next one's January. July. Thanks, Alex. It could be adopted in July. If we were to hold public hearings, notices, and referred it and had APC meetings with all 6 APCs, the timeline is likely the end of the year, January. So that's just it. Part of that extra length would be because of all of that APC meetings. It just gives a sense of how things that certain applications could move forward. I generally would eliminate about 3 weeks of processing time. When we hold a public hearing, the advertisements that are required really is the area where it takes up a lot of time. We have to have ads to the paper basically a month before the public hearing is held. So it just adds a lot of time. Plus, there's a significant amount of staff time involved in setting up every public hearing. I think that's what I had for my notes to talk about. I'm happy to stop there and answer any questions.
Hey, is there any questions? Director Sagan. Do I have to do something here?
Thank you. I would be in support of this in terms of the expediency of making decisions. I was wondering if the area director could have a heads up with a background, like ahead of time, and notice of any feedback that the public is giving.
Yeah, certainly. So part of the process with a regular, a private rezoning application is it will be reviewed by the Advisory Planning Commission before coming to the board. So the area director and the alternate director are both involved in that and see the staff report when it goes to the APC before it comes to the board. So you'd have the initial heads up, and then certainly any feedback we get out of the notice we would share with the director, but that feedback would also come to the board, and And again, sort of the board at that time could decide there's been a lot of feedback or concern raised, we could switch gears and still hold a public hearing. So in instances where there's been a lot of feedback or it appears to be a contentious issue, staff could either recommend or still provide an option with the second report to hold a public hearing. So that's how I envision this working. And each one would be dealt with on a case by case basis. So it's not a blanket, every application that complies with your CP automatically follows this process. The board has to make a specific resolution on each one. And not always, but most of the time, as staff, we recognize, when something could be contentious or not contentious as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Director Beckett, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. So like Director Suga, I am in support in principle of supporting this and streamlining the process. I think what I would like to have some discussion around is the public notification. By right now, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, only notification is in the only required legislative notification is that of the newspaper. That I know we've had discussions about that in the past. That continues to be a concern for me. My comfort would be letters to the adjoining properties as an example. But I'm going to stop there, Madam Chair, and ask Mike to weigh in a little bit on my comments, please.
Right.
Great. Great comments, Bob, and thanks. So for individual rezoning applications, these would also have the neighbor notification, that's currently part of a public hearing process. So if somebody on lot A on First Street was applying to rezone, we're still required to notify all neighbors within 100 meters. The other thing that's coming up in one of the later reports today is around the fees and the sign bylaw. So there's a recommendation to change the requirements for the sign bylaw as well, which provides some more early notice to people in a much more visible way for neighboring property owners that are most affected. So I can give a quick explanation about that, and we'll talk about it and decide later. But staff are proposing that when somebody applies to rezone the property, that at the time of application or within 2 weeks of applying, that they post a large sign. We haven't figured out exactly how big it would be, but clearly visible from the road. We see them as we drive through other communities. I'm sure the city of Port Alberni does that as well. So that gets posted, and then there's basically a spot for a sticker to be put on when the public hearing's held. So it provides advance notice to the neighbors by doing that, and it would be in addition to the letters that would go out as well. And then with regards to what you were mentioning, Bob, we've had a couple of ACRD initiated applications, and we can, as staff too, we certainly want to revisit how we provide public notification rather than just in the newspaper. We'll be providing some more options on those case by case files as well. But we certainly recognize we need to do more than just put notices in the newspaper. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, Director Cote.
Thank you. I haven't been a big fan of this in the past. I would like to speed things up, but just a couple questions on who decides when this doesn't go to public hearing. If the director decides that they would like to have this go to public hearing, is that a board decision then, rather than the director decision? Because that would make a big difference. Thanks.
I'm happy to answer. it's always the board decision on every vote that happens. Yeah, and I would note we've had a number of contentious rezoning applications. So one in Sprout Lake and one in Cherry Creek, and I do want to note that both of those this wasn't an option in either case. Those required OCP amendments. So if there's an OCP amendment, it must go. And we certainly can, talk about what the criteria, is for when this goes forward. But if it's for a commercial development, for example, even though it may comply with the OCP, so as say we had a hotel development anywhere in the regional district proposed, as staff, I would be recommending that we hold a public hearing on something that's significant. This is more for those 3 to 5 lot rezoning applications where we have 1, 2, or nobody show up to the public hearings is the intent. But again, this is dealt with on a case by case basis, and would also be referred to the advisory planning commission. That the recommendation in the report is still referred to the advisory planning commission.
You, through the chair to staff. I don't know of a subdivision 3 to 5 subdivision that in my area that wouldn't have public wanting to have some kind of input in. And if I decide to agree to this now, that eliminates my option to take a look at something and say, I'd like this to come back. I have to rely on the board, and I don't believe I can going forward. So that's why I don't want to support this. Thank you.
And I guess that's a question or comment I can't provide an answer to that. That's why we're bringing it here for this discussion. And I think as staff, we will provide, whatever the direction of the board is, we'll follow that. And we will also provide, input. We'll recognize where we know there's contentious, files in some cases. We often know that ahead of time. But that's, again, this is a decision for the board. And like I said, it's not something that's blanket. Like we're bringing this forward saying, is this something the board will consider? And it's considered on a case by case basis. It's not a blanket. You can't pass a policy or a bylaw that where a rezoning application complies with the OCP. It has to go through this process. Each application requires a specific resolution by the board. So and the other thing I do want to flag is we have a lot of applications, and over the last 3 years, we've I guess 2 things. We've gotten behind on processing applications, but also for staff and all of the planning staff that are managing and doing this, it's not sustainable what we've been doing up to now. The number of meetings and what's involved trying to get this process through in a timely manner. And for us as staff, we have the public and the applicants coming to us like, why is my applications being held up? We've had people talking to us about it impacting their financing, or they're not going to get their loan. And this isn't necessarily related to some rezoning applications, but the number of public hearings and the length of time it takes to process rezoning applications impacts all of the other applications we do around development variances, around development permits, etc. So it's just something I think we need as staff, I think we need to bring this to the directors, and I just want everybody to be aware of that.
One follow-up. Thank you. So knowing that, and I do want to speed things up, but I'm just concerned about the process. So could we reverse it where the directors could say we don't want to have a public hearing? We would like to waive it on certain applications, so that there is what I would consider protection for the community to have a voice.
Yes, and so I think this is why, if I may, this is why we want to introduce this. If the the board ends up with your endorsement, saying, yes, that we're going to open up and use this section of legislation, it provides a tool. Where right now we're sort of in autopilot for public hearings and we add everything in. This adds a tool where we can say, actually, we don't think we need one on this. And it's important to flag that if we get it wrong, and sometimes we will, right? We'll say we don't need one. The public will write in. They still have the opportunity to provide comment. If we see that we're getting a mixed bag of yeses and nos on issues, we can still bring it back and say, we're going to pause. We originally waived, but given the comments that are coming in, we're going to set a public hearing, hear people out properly, and then move forward. It's simply adding the tool to the basket that we have. And by doing so, though, then it does bring a discussion to the board. My experience thus far is where the board sometimes disagrees is on advancing readings. But I think when it comes to public outreach, I think the majority of the board has been talk to the public rather than not. But you have a right to be concerned there as well. Ultimately, all we're proposing here is that we add this tool to the basket of tools that we have, which then gives you the ability to say, we're going to waive the public hearing in this case.
Director Boyko.
I share some of the concerns that Director Cote has. The exact wording in the Local Government Act is a local government is not required to hold a public hearing on a proposed zoning bylaw if two conditions. An OCP is in effect for the area that is subject to the zoning bylaw, and the bylaw is consistent with the OCP. But the key word here is a local government is not required to hold a public hearing, but it comes down to how that decision is made and whether it's the electoral area director making that decision for that thing, or if it's the board together making the decision for each thing. And it needs to be basically the best wishes of the people, however that's done.
Director Sparrow.
For that. I've only had one public hearing so far, and it was supposed to be quite quiet until it wasn't. And one of the reasons that was they finally read it in the paper after the two readings. So I understand what you're trying to do and trying to get through faster, and I agree with that. But the problem seems to be the fact that people aren't getting the information up quick enough for some reason. I don't know why, but they just don't seem to be getting it to them in time. And by the time that meeting showed up, definitely we had a difference of opinion in that meeting. But and that meeting, if it fits inside the OCP and it wasn't an Atlas change, it wouldn't have to go to a public hearing under what you're proposing right now. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It has to comply. It has to comply to the OCP. And I think the public notifications, are something that we, will mail out. But I think the other key to this is amending the procedures bylaw to require large signs posted at the time of application. I think that's the other part, making sure the public is aware, because that will initiate people coming in to ask, what's going on, what's happening, when's the public hearing, if people have concerns about this, about what the HRD is proposing for changing the land use in that area. So I think, this, all of the steps in this, sort of regardless of whether we're having public hearings or not, the sign bylaw or the sign requirements is also a key component to keeping the public informed early. Because I think that's the other thing that we're hearing is, currently we post an 11 by 17 laminated, or we prepare a 11 by 17 laminated piece of paper, and it gets put on a telephone pole close to the property, and you have to get out and walk up to it to read it. What we're proposing is, large, 3 by 6 signs that can be read and visible from the road.
Thank you. Director Cote.
Thank you. I have a question then. The application for McAdee's had a large sign, and so did Sprout Lake Landing. Did you have any calls from those two signs from the community?
I don't think they had large signs. The public hearing notice signs were not. All I'm saying is our public hearing notice signs were not the large signs. Unless we did a little bit bigger one to post. But what we're proposing for signs is wooden structure signs rather than just a laminated piece of paper tacked to a telephone pole. And I don't recall I recall the public hearings for McGee and Stroh Lake Landing. I don't recall sort of if there was discussions about the signs or not. But the other part about the signs is when they would be posted. So currently they're put up 10 days before the public hearing. So what we're proposing is they would go up within a couple of weeks, 2 weeks of the application being made. Even if the public hearing is 3 months, not held for 3 months, that sign stays up, and people know that it's still an active development application. So that's the other part. I think the size of the sign matters, and when the sign gets put up, getting put up early is important.
So if we would approve this, there would need to be an educational program that's put out to the public, because they are not aware that they're going to have to initiate their own calls coming to a application. Sorry.
Yeah, no, if I could just address that one. So there's still the requirement for the regional district to notify all property owners within 100 meters of the property being rezoned, and still put 2 ads in the newspaper. That's still a requirement even under this process as well. So that's what I'm saying. It's really similar to the temporary use permit process, except that we put 2 ads in the newspaper.
Okay, I'm kind of curious about the legislation, Fred or Director Boyko, you said it talked about effective OCP. Is that right?
An official community plan is in effect for the area that is subject to the zoning bylaw. That just means there is an OCP for that area. And the bylaw, the rezoning bylaw, whatever, is consistent with the official community plan.
Okay, that's okay. How, like Beaver Creek's OCP is 10 years old. So I'm a little bit worried about it being old and, applying today's problems or today's issues with something that doesn't really reflect the community anymore. What's the timeline for new OCPs or the comprehensive reviews for the OCPs in each of the areas?
We're going to talk.
Yeah, we're under legislation, your OCP is still in effect. So,
Yeah.
It is an OCP in effect. And the OCP is an aspirational document that's sort of pointing to the general direction of where we want to go. I think the point of the legislation is that where there's these 2 points that align, so you're okay for the OCP, you meet all the other standards, if you can waive, because there would have been public consultation around all of these documents. It doesn't force you to waive. I think that's the important thing to flag here. It doesn't force the board to waive anything that they feel ought to have a public hearing. And so all it does is say that you have the option. And so staff would come back and consider that option in their recommendation. It may be an alternative or it may be the recommendation. But ultimately, if it meets the standards of the legislation, we would simply flag it as an option for the board to consider, whereas right now we don't flag that option.
Did anyone else have any questions or comments? Director Boyko?
So when you say it's flagged as an option, would that come to the board on the first hearing? And then we can say, okay, yeah, this is going to be a cookie cutter application that meets the OCP, and it will be flagged as not requiring a public hearing. And then the board, all electoral area directors vote on it at that point?
That's correct, up to the point where eventually the whole board would vote on it, right? The appropriate board members that are part of that.
Any other questions or comments?
Just what Director Cote had mentioned, putting it as an option. So when we do staff reports, we always make the recommendation. And so I just want to make sure that I'm understanding, is the concern that it's the automatic recommendation that gets put, say, on the front page, and as opposed to options 1 and 2, would that be a better, is that something that's more palatable, I guess, to the directors, so that even on the front page of the agenda, for example, we're rezoning for a property lot A somewhere, and we just put it right on the front page that option A is not hold a public hearing under the section of the Local Government Act. Option B is, give it first reading, delegate a public hearing, and proceed in that option. Is that something that even as we start this, that makes more sense to the directors? Because I think that's certainly doable. It adds a little bit to the front page of the agenda, but it puts both options front and center, and then so in the report, staff can say we think this is the appropriate way to move forward, but ultimately it's the board's decision always.
Director Cote?
Thank you, through the chair. That is part of my concern is recommendation coming from staff. And because we are overloaded with work, I'm concerned that some things are going to get pushed through, that as a director of the area, you might want to see that public hearing held for whatever reason. Even though it's not well attended, it still gives the public the opportunity to speak. So, and when it goes automatically as a recommendation and ABC, whatever, I'm sure that staff would like to make the recommendation that, yes, this is just goes, because it doesn't seem controversial, but the director may see something, there could be something in Banfield that we have no idea about. And then, and the director says, well, maybe we should do this, but we all see the full agenda and what we all have to do. So that's where my concern is that, yeah, it's going to be something that comes from the board because it ticks off all the boxes and it's made a recommendation to go through, and no, we don't need a public hearing. But I've heard pretty loudly that people like to know what's going on and have their opportunity to speak when it comes to the OCP. So does that make any sense?
So certainly, unless Wendy thinks that it's a problem, we could when this is an option, we could just put options 1 and 2 on the front page of the agenda, so that either option is clear for all of the directors. And the other thing, like the process in how we would get to the board voting on this would be, we get the application, staff prepare the report, it's still reviewed by the Advisory Planning Commission prior to coming to the board. We'll have the Advisory Planning Commission's input that the director and alternate director, both are involved in here, and then comes to the board. So we have that additional information from the Advisory Planning Commission, and then we certainly could just put, options 1 and 2, and leave it to the board to decide. Because certainly this is, as staff, we want to do things efficiently, but I also recognize that, when things blow up, they just take a lot longer. So that's, sometimes that happens and we don't, through no fault, that's part of the public input process. That's, that's not, it's a good thing. But we try to be cognizant as well on what the neighbors are going to think. We're familiar with all of this. Planning staff are really familiar with all of the areas and neighborhoods within the regional district, and we often know what flashpoints are, not always. So I think that what I'm hearing is keeping both options on the front page of the agenda is something that's important as well.
I'm curious, what about if an application meets the OCP in one area but doesn't in another area, however it goes forward anyways because it does in one area?
Well, legally, you know, if there's a couple of sections of the OCP that would apply to a given application, it has to meet all of that, or the OCP has to be changed. And any OCP amendment, no matter how minor, requires a public hearing.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
Mhm. Okay, Director Sega?
Thank you. This seems to be going back to informing the public and keeping them informed. And I'm just wondering if there is a possibility of having a summer student development app where any zoning that is changes or applications where that are being proposed can be posted on an app that's a quick link and done early before the newspaper notice.
Thank you. Yeah.
I can try and answer that one. I don't know about the development of an app at this point, but you are absolutely correct in terms of our working towards making sure that people living in certain areas have easier access to information about what's going on in their community. That is something that we're talking about as staff. And it's something that we're also talking about here at the table in terms of the difference between a public hearing and public engagement. And so, you know, and I think that's slightly different than what we're talking about in this one decision, but it is really important. And when I'll tie it in, because if as staff, if we can save 30 hours on an application that really is not contentious, is straightforward, and we're going through the motions simply because those are the motions, if we can take those 30 hours and plug them towards having better engagement on contentious files, where rather than have 140 people standing angry at a public hearing, we actually set tables and have dialogue around what it is that we're hoping to do with the public. That would be time better spent, and that's what we're trying to achieve as staff, is how do we liberate some of this elbow space so that we can increase the amount of effort for good dialogue on contentious files and decrease the time allotment, because it's not needed, on files that really aren't contentious and are really what I would call no-brainers. I would say that cautiously. But it's, yeah, and part of it is exactly what you're talking about, is how do we get that information into the hands of people early, easily, so they're not having to feel like they're digging around. And I think it's probably going to end up with a bit of a strategy that'll start first with our website, but then we'll branch out into what fits best within each one of the regions. It could be an app. It could be, like in some cases, the mailouts that we sometimes do quarterly in some areas. There's a lot of different ways that we could explore that. But I think on that front, it'll be a bit of a tailored to the sub-region approach.
Thank you. Director Cote?
Thank you. Question. So when the actual application or whatever comes to the board and the recommendations comes to the whole board, it doesn't come to the electoral area directors. Who votes on that?
These ones would all be electoral area directors.
Okay. So the board, even though that they, just recognizing that even though they don't vote, they have a say in moving things along. So anybody at the board can speak. So
Director Boyd?
That has always been the board's practice.
yes.
My entire time here is anybody who wishes to speak on a matter, regardless of whether they vote or not, has always been provided an opportunity to speak.
Right. Okay. So can we do we have to execute this approval and then can we just use it as needed, or is this a blanket?
No, this would be used when the area director and the board's voting decided that it was appropriate.
One option.
Yes.
As
Director Boyko, did you have something?
Something relating to that conversation about 2 minutes ago, when we're having a planning matter or electoral only area director only discussion and topic, bringing other people from the board that happen to be at the table, talking about things and saying, I might live in this area and I want to have my voice on it. Should that be a discussion point at the table while people are getting ready to vote? Or should they be considered members of the public and their discussion should go to a public hearing as opposed to the board table? That was what I was trying. Thank you.
It does make sense. And I think that would be a larger discussion to have with the board on different issues, because that spans well beyond just planning issues. The reality is that, you know, when we switch into the mode of EA directors only for voting, we still retain a number of different directors for quorum to carry us through that portion of the meeting. And you know, it'd be up to the board to say, look, can you just let the EA directors have the conversation? Would be a shift from what we currently do. But it would be, I think, one of those unwritten rules that the board could put in place as guidelines, or written rules, and if you wanted to adjust it. But yeah, like it wouldn't be for staff to dictate on that one. It really is about the dynamics of this table with the elected officials and how you choose to do that.
Director Sparrow.
Can I make an amendment to the motion? We put on the very end with the approval of the electoral area director. The very last wording, so that the area director has the authority to decide. Is that allowed?
Well, technically not, because at the end of the day, the on any decision that's made at this table, the strength is, or the legitimacy is in the body, not in the individual. And so on any of our elected, whether it's a municipal council, whether it's a regional board, the individual elected person has no power to direct anything. It's the body of it's the elected body that ultimately decides. In the same way that you need some people that are not voting to still stay on, because that gives legitimacy to the quorum, to the meeting, and to the body. Yeah, so that one, we could get illegal on it, but my knee jerk would be no. That probably wouldn't fly.
Director Beckett.
Thank you. I am quite comfortable in, having the board, as Daniel just spoke about, having the board weigh in and providing their insight and thoughts, recognizing that at least where I'm coming from, I'm going to listen very closely to the electoral area director whose community this matter may be coming before us. So having said that, when it is appropriate during this discussion, if there needs to be more discussion, fine. If not, I'm prepared to move the existing motion that staff have prepared for us.
Would you like to do that now, or was there any more discussion before, or there can be discussion after as well?
Madam Chair, then I would make the motion, and then if there needs to be more discussion after that, that would be great. So the motion is that the Electoral Area Directors Committee recommend the Board of Directors direct staff to prepare a rezoning application reports with the option to give notice. A public hearing will not be held as per section 467 of the Local Government Act when the proposed rezoning complies with the electoral area official community plan.
Can I have a seconder, please? Director Boyko? Any more discussion or any amendments to the motion? Okay. All in favor? All against? I guess motion carried. Yes. Okay.
You don't vote that for the
Okay.
Sorry, maybe you didn't see him. Yeah, sorry, Penny, I was looking at you, but.
Okay. So we can move to the next request for decision, development permit and development variance permit procedure options. And is that you, Mike?
Thank you. I just wanted to highlight that in this report that there are options to delegate all development permits to staff. So currently, development permits related to natural hazards and riparian areas within official community plan areas are delegated to staff. We have a process. A number of you have dealt with these development permits, and possibly, you know, and maybe a couple haven't. So I'll quickly explain the process. So a development permit, there's guidelines in all of the official community plans around hazard areas, you know, such as steep slopes and tsunami areas, as well as sensitive riparian areas. And so if somebody wants to develop or subdivide, et cetera, and is affected by these development permits or is doing any work inside the development permits areas, they need to engage a qualified professional. So in the case of natural hazard areas, it's generally a geotechnical engineer, and in riparian areas, it's generally a biologist. They prepare a report, determine it's the best way to develop and that it's safe for the intended use, if that's the appropriate recommendation. And then staff prepare a development permit. The area director reviews it, and then the CIO signs off on it, and that development permit. It also gets registered on title so that people know it's there. We also have form and character development permits. Again, those are guidelines generally relating to commercial, industrial, and multifamily developments in high visibility, high traffic corridors along the highways, for example, or the entrance to Banfield. So those have not been delegated to staff. And so the process there is similar to other applications. It's reviewed by the Advisory Planning Commission and then comes to the board for a vote. But development permits are a little bit different than most of the other applications that the board members deal with, in that they are not discretionary. So the law says if a person meets the development permit guidelines, the development permit has to be issued. And this can be quite time consuming running through the development permit process. And it is something that can be delegated to staff, and we follow the same process that we do for the riparian and hazard areas. So that's one component of the staff report. And the other is that, just find where I am in my notes, is that the Local Government Act recently was amended to allow minor variances to be delegated to staff. And so on page 10 of the report that we have here, one of the things is that it has to be done by bylaw, so that would happen in the development procedures bylaw if the board was to do this. And in the bylaw, the board would have to define what a minor variance is and define the guidelines that staff would use to consider when issuing the variance. So just, you know, as a draft, what the board for consideration on what could be a minor variance we put together here it's when a structure or construction has not started. So this is when somebody comes in and applies prior to starting, not after the fact, and then find out that they put it in the wrong spot. And you know, could be a height variance of less than 3 meters, a side yard variance of less than 3 meters, front and rear yard variances less than 3 meters, stream and water body variances of less than 3 meters when supported by a biologist report. Fence heights of less than 5 of a meter, and the number of parking spaces when looking at required in a development. The other part, we didn't draft any of this yet because we wanted to get a sense of is this something the board wants to consider or not, is there would have to be guidelines as far as how staff would look at it, similar to what the board considers when they're issuing a variance. It couldn't have a big impact on the neighbors. It has to be safe. Doesn't shade neighboring properties, etc. The other thing that the act requires is that if somebody applies for a variance and say it was not issued, they have the opportunity to ask the board for reconsideration of the staff decision. That's just it's built into legislation. It's an automatic. So it's not staff have the final word if the applicant's unhappy. It's ultimately the board can override the staff decision was. So I think that's sort of a quick summary of what that is, and just wanted to, happy to answer questions regarding this. And I guess the other thing I did want to talk about is we do deal with a lot of these smaller types of variances where we get they come through the board. There's no feedback, no concerns raised, generally. The other thing I would flag is that if it's a minor variance, it is not. There's no neighbor notification required. So that's not part of the process. So happy to answer any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Director Cote?
Thank you. I would be prepared to accept this if there was notification to the neighbors, because that would eliminate the rest of the process. But and I've seen quite a few different variances come to me as the director, and I don't believe it's gone any further than that. And then it goes to the board.
Currently, if it's a development variance, as opposed to a development permit, a development variance currently has to be approved. Staff never anything on it.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Was there a question about notice to neighbors though?
Yeah. Just could there be a notice to neighbors? Or
So there's still the legislative requirements for notice to neighbors still has to be met. So you still have to produce that where it is required. And in developing the procedures, this is where what we draft, if you're open to receiving something, we would draft what steps need to be followed. So this is where you would have a hand in ensuring that certain criteria that you want met as a board are met by staff, and that would be part of the delegation. Because we don't want to be considering something that you would want considered or vice versa, right? So we want to be perfectly aligned. The intent of something like this is to make sure that we are doing it as you would want it done for a decision. And if anything falls outside of that, of course, then it would come to the table instead. Or if the landowner was saying, we're not happy with the outcome, they can trigger that and bring it back. Which you would probably be the first one to get the call if they were unhappy anyway. So I think there's a good fail-safe in the system, but we would draft those details and bring it back as part of the procedures.
foreshore is always an issue in my area. So I'm just a bit concerned. And if we go down to the future and talk about docks, there's always controversy around those. So I don't know what kind of notification or I don't know how that's going to work. Right?
Sure. So with docks, that would be dealt with under development permit. So currently, under the OCP, the Stroller OCP that just amended, if somebody's building a dock, they will need to get a development permit, and so that would be reviewed by staff, and then if it's in Stroller area, you would look at it and then we would issue it. But that's the development permit. That is not discretionary. So if they meet the guidelines, they we're legally obligated to issue the development permit. That's the requirement. So a variance would be if somebody, I haven't, like what we're proposing wouldn't vary. We don't have any limits on docks right now, but if we did, it wouldn't necessarily be part of something that would be delegated to staff, because I think would be a contentious issue. So we're talking about things like a setback from a water course or a front yard or rear yard setback. As Daniel mentioned, we certainly could build in some public notification. So the act says that there's a section that talks about there's no obligation to give notice if variances are delegated to staff, but that's something we could build into the guidelines and procedures. If it's delegated to staff, we would be required to send out notice, wait 10 days before staff issue the variance. That's something that we could build into the guidelines, and that's wanted to have this discussion first before we even propose anything around guidelines. So that's certainly something that could be built in, that we still notify neighbors and wait 10 days prior to being issued. I'm just sort of throwing that out there.
That sounds good. I'm thinking of all of the issues that I'm facing today with foreshore development, trailers on beaches. I always get the calls. So infill, I don't know what's permitted and what's going to be part of the variance permit or variance development.
Those types of things, like the infill, the impact would be a development permit, and often there would be a development permit if somebody's building close to a stream or a lake, and if there was a variance requirement as well. But it would both have to be supported by a biologist in this case, and potentially a geotechnical engineer if it's a flood hazard area. So we would be looking at those as well. And I think the key to this is, for the variance part, construction can't have started. So if somebody built a retaining wall to build a shop close to a stream and construction started, that automatically would have to come to the board the way we drafted this here, because it wouldn't meet the definition of a minor variance because it's already been started. It would be, if somebody came in and they would like to build, 47 feet from the stream, they have a biologist report that supports it, it's not in a flood area, the process we just talked about, staff would send out a notice to neighboring properties, wait 10 days, and then consideration in the variance. So I feel it was really important that we separate people that come in, get their permits ahead of time, as opposed to people build, get caught. I think that's something that the board should be making the decision on whether to issue that variance or not, rather than staff.
Thank you. Director Boyko, did you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. My question just relates to how we arrived at the 3-meter measurement. Is that a common point where we kind of say, okay, we get lots of applications below that, and above that it's kind of more report. But the one thing I'm really more concerned about is the number of parking spaces, because that relates more to businesses as opposed to residential. And it's very specific in the current and the new zoning bylaw about parking spaces, and how important is that accessibility, and making changes like that might be something to help. Thank you.
Yeah, we looked at the types of variances we deal with, and wanted to consider something minor. I didn't want to propose minor being everything, but also recognizing that we have larger setbacks, etc. So that 3-meter, 10 feet seemed to be a reasonable amount. The height, it's fairly significant. So we would, Director Cody's suggestion about neighbor notification is reasonable. Again, all of these are whatever the board wishes to do. So this is, at this stage, is this something the board wants? We're asking if this is something the board wants to consider. If it is, we would have to bring back an amendment to the development procedure bylaw in order for this to happen or take place. So that's why. And then the parking spaces, we had just flagged that that's an option. We could make it a number of parking spaces, or we could take it out. It's not something we very, very often, or and parking spaces aren't something that comes up. I mean, almost, it's a handful of times in the last decade, I would think, that we deal with. We just don't deal with a lot of commercial, but sometimes there's, we might be dealing with, say, a storage area that requires 10 parking spaces and they only have room for 8. And it's, it might be really obvious that 8 is going to be more than adequate. But it's not something we have to do. It's just something that's there. And we can put a limit on it. So no more than 3 parking spaces is also an option.
Director Boyko?
Thank you very much, Mike, for the clarification. Yeah, I think maybe a limit on parking spaces and the height, an extra 3 meters in height, that seems quite a bit, especially where people are much closer together, blocking views in different places and that kind of thing. But other than that, I think it would reduce the staff and board time moving forward and speed up some applications as well. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Director Cote?
Thank you. Through the chair, staff again, for a pre-development, would there be fines, and would we be doing an education session to inform the community that we're making changes like this?
Yes, I think informing the community is a good idea. And as staff, we would be, sending that messaging out. We would do that. I think in general, it would be well received because it's going to speed up, the time people have to wait in certain instances. So, there's that, there's that option. And then, I think as you mentioned about the pre-development. So we, my recommendation is that this only applies if construction hasn't started. Because those things where people have already started construction, I think that needs to be dealt with, by the board, and I think that's the only fair process. And we have, over the years, we have dealt with a lot of variances where it was either construction was started without a permit, or they built it in the wrong spot, and then when the survey happened, it was 2 feet out, for example. So.
Okay.
I would have to review the fines. So the fines would have to be under our bylaw notice. And it would have to be related to zoning if we were going to do that. The other part of this is when we get to the fees, I will talk about the fee structure, because if we do this, I would propose we also amend the fees and have a different fee structure for variances that come to the board, just because there's a lot more time involved versus the variances that are dealt with by staff. But I think a fee structure is probably the more appropriate way to deal with that as well. Similar to what we did with building permits, is that when construction happens or starts without a building permit, then it's a lot more time for the building inspector, so it's not.
What about, Mike, what about road frontages? Could that be included on the list? Or is it? And I missed it.
The 10% road frontage we did not include because the act says it can only be delegated to an approving officer.
Oh.
And we're not the approving officer, so I would not recommend that we let the Ministry of Transportation make those decisions.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, Director Cote?
Thank you. I would move that the development permit and development variance permit procedures option, that the EA Directors Committee recommend to the ACRD Board of Directors that the development procedures and fees bylaw P1403 be amended to delegate minor development variance permits and form and character development permit to the CAO or GM of planning and development.
Seconder? Director Boyko? Thank you. Any more comments or questions? All in favor of the motion? Motion carried. Okay, so we can move to request for a decision on development procedures and fees bylaw updates. Mike?
Yes, thank you. There's two components to this report. The first one relates to fees. So I would just note that fees have not been reviewed. Predominantly, the fees have not been reviewed since 2006, and I would, they don't even begin to cover the cost of processing development applications. So on page 15, there's a table, and these are proposed fee changes, and could include some of the notice requirements and changes in fees in the notice requirements. And if it's all right, I'd just like to run through, I don't want to run through all of them, but just highlight some of them. So the first one would be the change. Currently, we just have a fee for comprehensive development zoning, and I would recommend that we consider minor comprehensive development, and with minor meaning one use plus green space. And we have done a number of applications over the years where we've used the comprehensive development section to create a site-specific zone for the ones that come to mind are vacation, not vacation rentals, but vacation homes. So we did this in a couple of areas in Spoke Lake, one on Beauty Island and one at the backside of Dog Mountain. And it seemed to, it was a site specific, it made sense. And I think a $5,000 fee for something like that is reasonable. And then there's proposing also a comprehensive development major. So this would be for a larger development with a $10,000 fee plus $2,000 per hectare. And this would be, a multi-use. It could be a mix of commercial, residential, vacation home, for example, something similar to what we have out at Great Central Lake Holdings. At Great Central Lake, that comprehensive development zone that people may be familiar with. The next part is increasing development permit fees. So currently, if it's commercial or industrial, the development permit fees are between $750 and $1,500, and just recommend that they would be increased to $1,500. And then rural and residential development permits currently are only $100, and looking at and increasing that to $300, which is not complete cost recovery, but also in the past we haven't. The board has wanted to provide an incentive for people to apply for development permits, mostly again for hazard areas and riparian protection. And this hasn't increased for a long time. So 300 seems like a reasonable amount for people to pay. And then the next one would be minor development variances that we just talked about that are delegated to staff, having that as a $300 fee. And then development variance permits other than rural and residential, so these would be not minor. That would be $1,000 fee plus $300 for the public notice that's required, just to capture the staff time that goes into holding APC meetings and the board time, recognizing the board time involved in all of that. And then increasing the public hearing fee from $600 to $1,000, and then including a $900 advertising and notice requirement. And that $900, captures what the current advertising costs are in the local paper, plus the time and cost of mailing out the notices to the neighbors, just so that it is more of a realistic amount. And then what a statutory notice when the public hearing is not held. So this would be what we were talking about in our first report around not holding a public hearing, but the notice is still required, just a $900 fee. And again, we capture costs. And just for reference, at the bottom of the table, I went back and added up the fees that we would have collected in 2022 based on the rezoning applications versus what we did collect. So under this proposed fee schedule in 2022, the fees would have been $70,000 or approximately $70,000 rather than the $20,000 that were paid at that time. So just for reference. And then the other component we talked a little bit about already was the signs, and that the development procedures bylaw be amended to increase the size of the signs, and that cost would be borne by the applicant, so they would need to go and have a sign made up similar. This is really similar to what the city of Port Alberni does, and other regional districts and municipalities, and then have that sign posted within 2 weeks of making the application, and that would give the neighboring property owners and residents, advance notice that that there's a development application for the property, and that there would still be the required notices in the newspaper and mail out as well. So I will stop there and answer any questions anybody has.
Director Boyko.
Yes, thank you very much, Mike. Some of those fee increases, as someone that has recently paid one, are quite a large jump from what they currently are. That being said, I'm looking at what other regional districts are doing. Yes, they're up there compared to ours. One of your desired outcomes here is to provide efficient, transparent, and accessible public service. So I get calls from people not only in Beaufort, but Beaver Creek and Cherry Creek and other places, asking what is the status of their application on a weekly basis. So one of the things I'd like to see is, if we're going to request that people pay significantly more than what they're currently paying, they could get a better idea of where their application is in the 13 steps it needs to go through. Have it public, visible, so they can look it up and say, okay, there's 130 in the queue and I'm 131. Not necessarily that, but okay, I've had the first public hearing, I've been to the advisory planning committee, that kind of things, and have all the steps laid out. So someone can look on there and say, okay, where's the status? Or I can say, hey, my neighbor's going to go build, X. I want to know what the status of his application is, and then you go do it. Because it's all public, but right now they either have to try and call an electoral area director or bombard staff with phone calls and emails, et cetera, to find out what's going on and that kind of thing. So if we're trying to make it efficient and transparent, if we're going to ask for more money, we should strive to be able to make it as transparent and easy as possible.
Daniel?
Thank you.
I think that's an excellent point, and one that I know you and I have discussed. And the Comox Regional District has a system, I think, that we looked at, which really is user friendly and gives that overview. So that is something that we are looking at and are going to navigate through. And adding to that as well, I know at a staff level, we've also had the discussion around short-term rentals and having a similar list for short-term rentals that receive the permit from us, because not everyone gets a permit, but a lot of people are Airbnb-ing. And I think it's just one of those things where it's useful for neighbors as well that say, that's not the usual car. Be able to look and say, oh, they actually have a permit, and if they happen to miss it when it was issued. So things like that are going to help with transparency. But what we don't want is something static like a PDF. We'd rather have something that will update itself as we're working through a file. Beyond that, though, I did want to make a comment of the sign going up within 2 weeks of an application being made. I say it a bit tongue in cheek, but it will also give the community a good idea of how quickly we process these. Because if 6 months later the sign is still up, it's a good indication that we're working on it, and perhaps not as fast as the public would want. But anyway, they're excellent comments, and I just wanted to flag that we are working.
And I was just going to add that we're in the process of updating it's CityView, which is our internal program that manages our property database, and there's going to be some options to do what you were talking about and keep that updated on the website on a regular basis. We'll certainly keep that in mind as we finalize that.
Director Beckett?
Thank you. I'm all for cost recovery. Like Director Boyko pointed out that when you took a look at page 14, we can see that staff are proposing significant increases over 100%, in almost all categories. my concern moving forward, and again, the bulk of our citizens, tax-paying citizens, this is not going to impact them, except if it's someone that's developing, subdividing, building, et cetera, et cetera. So where I'm going with this is, how do we ensure that a board 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, doesn't end up with the same scenario where we're having to justify and approve a very significant increase? So my thoughts are, is there a COLA kind of increase that could be incorporated into this? Because when I look at the potential growth and the interest in the Bamfield community, there's going to be folks that are going to come back and say, well, what the heck? Last time I looked, it was only $500 and now it's $3,000. So I'm just sensitive to these type of large increases in a very quick period of time. Thank you.
Daniel?
I can answer that, and it might be useful actually just to do what we've done with the airport and create a policy that says that we bring this back with a benchmarking every 5 years, for example, and that way at almost every term, elected officials will be able to take a look at it and talk about whether it still fits the market needs or benchmarking against other appropriate regional districts. But what we can't do is wait 20 years. And then this is the problem that we face on anything, is that it's going to hurt. Just like the airport, like we just did increases at the airport. And in some cases, it's been too long since we've done increases. So the sticker shock is tough for people to absorb. And by default, we end up looking at a phased implementation. But if we don't do it on a regular basis, then we end up subsidizing these to the taxpayer. And that is equally problematic. So I would recommend that we also match this with a policy that says every 5 years, as a general practice, staff are directed to come back with a benchmark proposal that shows a shift in rates.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Director Cote?
Thank you, Chair. So Director Beckett, were you making a motion then to take a stepped approach with the increases?
Thank you.
Sorry, through the chair. I would make the motion 6C. I would make that motion with the added stipulation that it'd be brought back to the board every 5 years for review.
Okay, can I get a seconder on that? Director Cote? Any more comments or questions? Okay, all in favor? Oh, sorry, did you have a question or comment? Director Sparrow?
Looking through here, you got recent permission with doing public notices for certain various variances. So if you do that with the public notice not being held, and then the board decides to have a public notice, you have to go back and re-ask the person for $1,000 more to have a public notice held. This says your statutory notice when a public hearing is not held, $900. A public hearing fee or statutory public meeting, $1,000 plus $900. So if that was happening, the board said this would be a public notice, should go back and ask applicant again for more money.
Sorry, I was just trying to collect my thoughts. When there's a public hearing held, we generally charge the applicant just before the public hearing, so they don't pay it up front. It's when the public hearing is held. With that, I guess what you're saying is yes. If a public hearing is held and if it was under this fee structure, it would be an additional $1,000 for the applicant. Yeah, but it still would be an extra cost.
Director Boyko?
Oh, I was just going to say, someone that just went through this. Yeah, you pay your initial fee, go through everything. And when it comes to the public hearing, they send you a bill before you get to that point now as it is. So that would just be both of them would just be increasing the.
Any other comments or questions? Okay. All in favor? Motion carried. Okay. And we move to request for decision on option for public hearing procedures. Would Mike like to speak?
Yes, I will introduce this briefly. Director Cote had asked that this be brought to the Electoral Area Directors Committee, or this topic. So I would just note that we've recently had some long public hearings, and I do want to note that we've had 3 public hearings that have gone well in excess of 2 hours, and they've been the longest public hearings that I've attended sort of in my 25 years of the district. They just, historically hadn't gone that long. And so in the past, we had never recommended that the chair at a public meeting or having a policy or guideline for running public hearings where there's limits on how long people could speak, etc. But maybe that's time to consider that. So I just wanted to note a couple of things. The first, just that the purpose of the public hearing is to hear from members of the public. And in the notes that staff provide to the chair, we talks about that the board, the comments should be on topic and should be directed to the chair. And I know sometimes things get heated in public hearings, and things that need to be sort of directed back. The board can have guidelines that staff could incorporate into the director of public hearing notes that we provide, this could include limits on first-time speakers and second-time speakers, etc. And and I think that's really. Oh, sorry. The other thing I just want to know that public hearing procedures and the requirements for public hearings and how they're held is governed both by the Local Government Act, but also by a whole raft of case law that people like Alex and I, Daniel, Wendy, we get to follow along to make sure that we're always following in there. So just one note, the requirement that the public hearing ad says it's delegated to a director isn't part of the act. That requirement comes out of case law. But if we don't put that in the public hearing ad, the public hearing is valid. So just a benign example. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Director Cote.
Thank you. I've asked this to be put on the agenda because of some things that have happened recently with public hearings. My own for Sprout Lake Landing. There was a few things that happened that I think were not shouldn't have been actually permitted. One of them was in the chat. There was a conversation going on that was put forward to the minutes. That should have never happened. I'm pretty strict with public hearings as far as sticking to being respectful. Anyone in attendance, the only person that in the room that is being spoken to is the chair. If there's any other conversations, they need to leave the room. The respect that people come up to the mic, this is their only opportunity to voice their opinions, whether they're for something or against it. And having a unruly crowd is not acceptable. I don't want it to happen to myself or anybody else. Respect is something that is expected. And public hearings are just like a court of law. The chair is the person that is the only one in the room that has the ear of everybody. And that is the person that is supposed to run this meeting in a respectful and timely manner, and making sure that everything follows the proper procedures and that it's on point. Things in the public hearing minutes are not anything that should be coming from another application or somebody's personal opinion whatever, it's on something else that's other than the actual application. So I know that people here at the table are new and probably have never run public hearings before, but it's really important that we stick to these set out rules that are, we didn't make them up. So it makes a big difference. You know, I've gone into public hearings and talked in support of something that people were opposed to, and it's scary to go into a room where there's a bunch of people that you know that they're opposed to something, but you see the benefit of it, or vice versa. Like, you have to be able to have that order in the room so that people have that opportunity to speak for or against. And I'd really like staff to come up with some new notes for us, starting off with the first thing is this is a respectful place and everybody has their opportunity to have their voice heard by the board, and this is your opportunity. We make every effort so that you are safe to come into this space. There's a lot of issues with First Nations that come forward and they don't feel safe. And this is one of those same occasions where you can see where that happens. So I want to make sure that our regional district has that in place. So in our new script, right at the top, this is a respectful place. Please have it in the writing. I try to add it when I do my opening, and I try to make sure that people understand that as you're going through the public hearing, and making sure that people understand that this is a privilege to be able to come here and say your piece, and that you can't be bullying other people. Excuse me. And as far as the chat, I think I'd really like to see something else done so that there's not side conversations happening in there, and then they get brought forward to the actual minutes. So I guess I would like to make a recommendation that staff come back with some recommendations for public hearing procedure. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Daniel?
I'll just, I think from a staff perspective, I'll just echo what Director Code is saying. It is really important to have standards, and on the staff perspective, it's important that the staff in attendance feel safe, because this is their workspace at the end of the day. And so when it comes to work-safe legislation, at the end of the day, I end up being responsible as the head of staff, and I have to look at it in that way as well. So I would certainly endorse what you're putting forward, because I think things are changing gradually, right? And I think as an organization, we've talked about this. We're growing. We're seeing more density in different areas. We're seeing a lot of different things that are contentious, and the public is dealing with a lot of things which can be confusing to the public. They often mistake in which level of government is doing what, and in that frustration, we can often be the accessible level of government that ends up bearing the brunt of that. But it is extremely important that we maintain safe workplaces. And for me, it's from a staff perspective, but I'll also echo for elected officials. It is challenging to be in the seat for anyone when people are unruly or when they're heated. So having public hearing standards that mention where the limits are and what the expectations are, I think is a reasonable request, is something that ought to be shared. And I can say it is something that we're discussing at a staff level, because it is like some of the most recent public hearings have been challenging on staff and have crossed the line in some elements. So regardless of whether staff say, or whether they brush it off or not, it's where the legislation sits in creating safe spaces that I want to make sure we're not slipping and we don't find ourselves on the wrong side of an investigation. So it's better to up our game. It's better to make sure that we're on the same page. And with that, it's I flagged it earlier in this meeting, but it'll be important for us to identify those public issues that are deserving of engagement and dialogue prior to a public hearing. Because I think what we're seeing is we've operated for many years where the public hearing is the only opportunity. And with some of the issues that we're dealing with, that's not good enough. People need to have an exchange. They need to be able to chew on an idea and understand how it impacts them. And reading the documents is not enough. So we're going to have to adapt and change how we engage, particularly on challenging files. And so it starts with public hearings. I think it's going to spread into engagement strategies and policies so that we can actually deal with some of this in a good way without being divisive in the community. Thank you.
Director Beckett?
Thank you. I agree with our CAO and Director Cote that we clearly need a process that provides appropriate engagement and dialogue, but in a safe and respectful fashion. And I can't help but think over the last 4 years or so, I've seen a deterioration, and I don't know if it's social media or politics south of the border that have influenced what people feel they can say. So I feel strongly about moving the motion that the Electoral Area Directors Committee recommend that the ACRD Board of Directors instruct staff to develop policy guidelines and procedures for required statutory public meetings and public hearings for consideration by the Board of Directors.
Did I get a seconder? Director Cote? Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Director Boyko?
Yes, thank you. I agree with what we're talking about here, but what the CAO is just talking about with regard to having increased public engagement outside of a public hearing in this particular room was great. And we're seeing the benefits of that in other areas. And with the increase in social media and people can share their ideas very rapidly, things can get very heated and excited. And sometimes it's for good reason, right? Sometimes it's for something that happened 10 years ago that no one knows about. Now all of a sudden everyone's excited about. But people need to have a place to talk about this, and they need to get their ideas brought forward. And we need to make sure we're having better public engagement so that we can reduce the chances of something like what happened here happening again. But the people need to have their place to chat, talk, and get their voices heard. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have one comment. Sorry, I was just concerned when I was in one of the meetings that we were over limit in the amount of people here. So I think we should place a restriction with whatever the code is for this room. Yeah. Did you have something, Director Cote?
I do. Thank you. I just want to point out that public hearings are not public town hall meetings. Other communities hold public hearings that take days. And what they do is they allow so many people into the room, to the mic. There's a lineup out the door. I don't know if they have to put a speaker because people have to be able to hear, but that's how they conduct their public hearing meetings. I'm not really in favor of taking this on the road for public hearings. I don't think that it's necessary. I think that we have a safe room here with the audio, video that we need. We can allow so many people in here. It's not that often that we have that many more, but we have also had meetings at Echo where there was standing room only kind of thing. But having it here and a lineup outside is, acceptable to me for public hearing, because this is where you're coming to state your opinion, how your interest is affected in property proposed by a bylaw. Period. It's not a discussion. It's your statement. You can come back if you hear other people, but that can be done by a speaker outside or whatever. However, That's all. It's not a public meeting. It's a public hearing.
Any other comments? Director Sparrow?
I think one of the things is since we've had this COVID thing since 2019 or whatever, people have been a little pent up and they haven't had a chance to speak. And when they came to the public hearing, they took it out likewise that there was something else to it and they wanted their voice heard. I think I heard them, but you're right. We have to do things a little differently. Maybe we have to go do like a town hall meeting to get that dialogue going so we can actually engage the people so they know exactly what's going on. Because the room, yeah, there was anger in the room, but I expected that. But they had a reason to because they didn't know what was going on and they feel like they still don't feel what's going on. They feel like we're making decisions for them without them. So we need to get back to engage with them so they know that we're making decisions with them, not against them.
Director Cote?
Thanks. I love the idea of public town hall meetings. I have them with my Sprout Lake Community Association. I don't call them myself. And I would recommend that directors do have public town hall meetings, but invite the staff so that you have someone there that can actually answer the questions or get back to people. That's the connection. They do the work. It's not us. We're sort of a voice for the community to the staff to support them. So I would recommend that if you're going to have a town hall, bring staff. They're our best asset. And thank you to you.
Any other comments? So we can, call the question. All in favor? Motion carried. Okay. So now we can move to reports, the bylaw enforcement policy and procedures.
That's me again, last one. So just really quickly, I thought this would be a good opportunity for the directors to just have, to review the bylaw enforcement policy and have a discussion and answer any questions. So I just, Charity's put this together for information for the board. The Charity does have a bylaw enforcement policy, and this policy provides direction to bylaw staff on how we deal with complaints and respond to infractions, etc. I do want to note that it is primarily complaint driven. There are a couple of exceptions. One of them being when the area director or ad director comes in and talks about something that they've seen or heard that bylaw staff, generally they talk to Daniel or myself, and we would direct staff to go out and investigate. Also, if something's observed that falls into sort of a category 1 enforcement, so that would be there's imminent danger to public safety, specifically around members of the public or children, we have a responsibility and liability if we don't to respond to those kinds of complaints and environmental. So if there's work going on in respond and often in those cases coordinate with other agencies. So we work with federal staff, and those where there's sort of combined jurisdiction. And in some cases where we have no jurisdiction, we will still work with that provincial or federal staff when something's come down. We mentioned before, we are the first, often the first place people do because we're much more accessible than other levels of government. And the other thing I did want to note because I've had some questions around the adjudication process and how that fits in. So this report also includes the adjudication process for bylaw notices. So those are tickets. It's just that we have. And the adjudication process is for when somebody wants to dispute their ticket. So, I'll coach this by saying we've issued 7 tickets. People understand. So we're not out there writing tickets on a regular basis. Or we've been very strategic in what we'll issue tickets for and when. only relates to bylaw infractions. So we can't issue tickets for other things at this point in time. That would require the board to pass some additional bylaws. So the ticket process is the ticket gets issued. There is, a complaint process where it would come to a screening officer. So that could be myself, it could be Daniel, for example. If it's not resolved, the person who received the ticket has the option to go to the adjudication process, which is bylaw court. It is administered by the city of Nanaimo, and multiple regional districts and other municipalities are all part of it, and we pay a small fee to be part of that, and then they bring in a mediator. It's not a judge, but it's I can't remember the name of that.
Justice?
No, not justice of the peace. No, it's like it's mediator. It's people, generally the lawyers, and they will adjudicate, determine if there's a bylaw action or not, and then either raise the ticket fee or so that was that. That was that process. Bylaw enforcement process. I thought it would be, again, for a sec, I will just keep speaking into the microphone. Sorry. Just go through a typical how we deal with a complaint. So the normal process, we would get a written complaint. It usually starts with a phone call. We explain to people that we're required to provide a written complaint. It just sort of helps weeds out frivolous complaints that people have. The policy talks about, if the person complaining, they have to be impacted by what they're complaining about. So somebody in Sprout Lake can't write a complaint about somebody in Cherry Creek. And so if that's the only complaint we get, our bylaw enforcement policy says, they have to be within close proximity. So we would say, thank you, but we're not going to take enforcement action. But so, if a neighbor, somebody close by, writes in, complains about a property owner, we will contact them generally by letter first, and basically that letter is, we've received this complaint, we want to provide an opportunity for you to provide input, before we determine if there's an infraction. So we always get both sides of the story. We then find out if there is an infraction or not. If it isn't an infraction, we let the person know the complaint. We've investigated and we're not proceeding anymore. If there is an infraction, and I think this is really important, it becomes the ACRD's infraction. It's the ACRD doing the enforcement. It is not, the idea isn't to pit neighbor against neighbor. So the complaint process is used by local governments and the ACRD, as a way to we don't have the staff to go around looking for things. So it has to be a written complaint. Once it's a written complaint, it's the ACRD's enforcement. And the ACRD as the body is responsible for moving forward, and the board decides if we're going to move forward or not, and that's why we have the policy. And then generally, if things can't be resolved, we have seen a number of case files that have come to the board. So the board would in camera deal with the bylaw infractions and determine after staff, if it can't be resolved, on what the next step would be, whether they go to court or not. And generally, if it goes to court, the first step is a letter from our lawyers, and then proceeding, as appropriate. And we have, the ACRD has taken a few cases to court, and they're few and far between. It's very expensive, and it's generally where it's a significant issue or problem in the community, and there's clearly no other way to get this resolved. So that's just a quick explanation of the process. Our goal at the staff level is always to come up with a resolution. I mean, over the years, we have people have been operating, industrial type businesses on their property. We've had a complaint about it. We've helped them find a different spot that they are allowed to work from, and things like that. So that's generally the approach and things we take. The idea. When we bring things to the board, we've exhausted all the other options, and from the staff perspective, there really isn't any other option going forward, and that's what we need to go direction. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from anyone or comments? Director Boyko?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I got 3 questions. Do the complaints have to be anonymous and can they be made public? Question 1.
I will answer that. So the complaints are never anonymous. So the complaints are always with a name, and their address, so that we need to be able to determine if it's a legitimate complaint. You know, I mentioned somebody in Stroll Lake can't complain about somebody in Cherry Creek. If we got multiple complaints from people, sort of that's written into the policy. So they're not anonymous for us. The complaints are not shared with members of the public. So you know, specific conversations that staff may have with the person complaining are not shared with the person they're complaining about, and vice versa. Specific conversations, the property we're investigating, for example, aren't shared with the person that complains. We will provide information that, yes, we still have it in file. And if you have additional information, please provide that to us. But, you know, very common practice that enforcement is dealt with on a complaint basis, and it is kept confidential until such time as if it ends up in court, somebody may need to be a witness, that becomes public. So Daniel had a comment.
So that is also subject to Freedom of Information Protection Act. So we have to follow the legislation. We follow the legislation there, and we don't disclose that information unless it ends up in court and a court compels that information to be disclosed.
Thank you. It's good to have that clarification, but it's also good to have clarification that has to be at least 1 complaint within 100 meters or 2 complaints within 200 meters. Because I hear people that say, oh, I got someone down the road, and then they get 15 people from Port Alberni complaining about something of Beaver Creek. But basically, all those complaints would be invalid at that point, right? Thank you. Thanks for clarification. Second question. Can bylaw officers enter a property at any time?
So I think the legislation says they can. We always notify people before a bylaw officer was to go on property. So we will, bylaw staff can use public roads and public property, just like anybody else. But if we are going to go onto anybody's property, we always let them know we're gonna do that. We don't. I think sometimes building inspectors will walk onto property if they're seeing construction happening to you know, again in that case to provide a card so that they can contact the office. And again, if at any time staff are asked to leave a property, we also leave the property. So there's no, you know, we're not going to force ourselves. And there are instances as well when we will attend with other agencies, you know, on site, and in some instances have attended with the RC.
Third quick question, Becky. So if someone gets a ticket for X amount of dollars, is that a ticket that is repeated every day, or is it 1 ticket for the offense until it's done? How does that work? Thank you.
So there is an ability to issue, you know, tickets, I guess, theoretically daily. We have never done that, and we have never issued more than 1 ticket. You know, if we were going to be regularly ticketing somebody, that is a discussion we would be having with the board. So we're not, you know, at this stage we are issuing a ticket. You know, we would issue 1 ticket, and there's some instances where, you know, frankly, it doesn't make sense to issue a ticket. You know, there's you know, the other tools would make more sense. And again, I think we've had those case-specific conversations with the board, and we will always continue to do that as well. And there's also been some case law, and I think people have probably read some things in the media about, you know, some local governments that have issued sort of those regular tickets. You know, and there's, you know, there's some legal consequences for the local government for doing things like that as well. And that, again, that's not something that is our practice. And unless we were directed to do that by the board, we would staff would be doing that.
Thank you very much for your time.
Director Cote?
Thank you. Have we, of those tickets, have we had anybody pay early or not pay?
we've had some that haven't paid. Just it's in the report, the last line of the report. So to date, the ACRT has issued 7 bylaw notices. 3 have been paid, so they would have been paid early, so they would have been the reduced fee. The other 4 were sent to collections, and one so far has been.
Director Cody?
Probably an in-camera question, but I'm just wondering why we're not putting out more tickets, more fines if they're not paying. Has things been resolved, or I guess we should wait till in camera.
Yeah, I think to discuss anything specific, we can do that in camera, and again, you know, I think we wanted. This is new. This was new for us. I know we've had the bylaw since 2020. The tickets have, you know, been a year, and we, you know, I think in a regional district context, it doesn't make sense to go out and regularly ticket people. You know, generally the infractions that we're dealing with, I'd say in most cases are resolved, you know, by either, you know, things quieting down, the nuisance or use stopping, or going to an appropriate level. I mean, what we generally go out and look at is what's the neighborhood standard. So if we, for example, get a complaint about, you know, a property A, the bylaw enforcement officer will go out, take a look, and see, you know, within the context of that specific neighborhood, you know, is this something that's significantly different if it's a messy property, or, you know, whatever the context is, and you know, does it fit into the neighborhood standard?
What do you usually ticket for?
We can certainly go on camera and I can provide some specifics. I think that would be more appropriate.
I have no idea.
Yeah. No, and I'm happy to share that, but I just think it'd be appropriate in camera because we've only issued 7.
Were they all the same? Same person? No. Okay, any other questions or comments? Director Boyko?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to make a motion that the Electoral Area Directors Committee receives this report on the bylaw enforcement policy and procedures.
Thank you. Seconded by Director Sparrow. All in favor? Motion carried. Okay, no late business. Question period. Is there anything?
No, Madam Chair, there's no public attending today.
Thank you. So do we need a motion for an adjournment? Moved by Director Boyko, seconded by Director Sparrow. Thank you. Pardon me? Oh yeah, all in favor? I was already closing it. Motion carried. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Veda. Bye, Bob.
Toodaloo.